Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. We're going to talk to Tim Keefe again today. We're going to get into Stoicism and some of their different positions on physics and theology. And most of these are based on a few different things, but most of, I think, what we're going to go through today is based on the Stoics Reader and notes that I took on physics and theology, and I think what Tim took on too. And I guess in case anyone doesn't know, Stoicism is an ancient philosophy that was around since I think the time of ancient Greece, and it's gained more popularity in recent years with people like Tim Ferriss. And yeah, so there are a lot of very different perspectives on these sorts of issues than the way we think about them now. And I'm sure we'll get into the details on that. So you want to just start off by introducing yourself for those people who don't know you, Tim?
Sure. So I'm Tim Keefe, and this is my second time with Andrew. We did a prior episode on postmodernism, which was also a follow up to a series I did with James of James and the Giant podcast. And that was a marathon session, but the last Mindgasms we had was much more doable. And so that's what I'm trying to shoot for here. And so we're going to be looking at Stoicism that is separate from what you're seeing in the common media with, in the last few years, there's been quite a lot of books coming out popularizing Stoicism, which kind of surprises me given how much I've read in philosophy over the years is that, oh yeah, well, Stoicism was around long before then, editions of Seneca and the rest, 20, 30 years ago or so. And I just, in some ways, I find it interesting and a bit humorous is that now it's become really popular versus what had happened all those years ago. But be that as it may, so in this podcast, I wanted to focus on a couple of different things concerning the Stoics, which I think is very important, apart from the logic, in terms of their physics, cosmology, and then the theology that they have in place, which is what, I would say that a lot of the popularizing aspects of Stoicism is drawn from these, is that how do the Stoics relate to their conception of the world, what their conception of God or the divine is, and how do they use that and the ethics and the way they conduct themselves in life draws from that. So it's a metaphysical cosmological view that you first have to get down straight, and then the ethics follow from that.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, there's it's interesting the more you learn about it how like their ideas about physics and what gods are and stuff like that are very different from the way we look at them today. And it's also interesting, like in terms of Stoicism, when they use the word God, how it kind of has different meanings depending on the context, and it can have multiple different meanings and stuff like that too. Um, so I think I guess, like we were talking about, to start off, I could just kind of go through the notes that I took here, and I'm sure you'll have a lot to add to it too that I took on these topics of their conceptions of physics and theology.
Sure.
So,
But before you get to that,
sure,
let's go
sure.
ahead and enumerate the books that we're going to be covering
Oh, sure. Yeah.
in this podcast. So the ones that I had, we discussed about this before we started. I sent you the Stoics Reader, which is
Mm-hmm.
published by Hackett Publishing, a very well reputable publishing firm that does a lot of critical versions of philosophy. And when did the Stoics Reader come out? Let me see. This was from 2008, so it's fairly recent. And it has a very nice selection of the basic writings from most of the Greek and the Roman Stoics.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's a slightly older one titled The Hellenistic Philosophers by A. Long and D.N. Seedley, published by
Right.
Cambridge University Press. And that comes in two volumes. The first volume is the translations of the selections from all of the Stoics divided into particular topics like propositions, the logic, fallacy, and so on. The second volume is the actual Greek and the Latin editions, the documents. I also have another book. It's called Greek Philosophical Terms, and this is a much older one. I say it's at least 30 years old, by F.E. Peters. So it's a really good reference book for specifically Greek philosophical terms, starting from the pre-Socratics, going through Plato and Aristotle. What are the meanings of particular terms like logos, or theos, or physis, or so on? Because as you noticed, depending on who the philosopher is in the time period, the word itself carries a different meaning. Even today in modern Greek, if you say the term logos, that could have at least 5 different meanings or so.
Right.
Yeah. So this is a really good reference material. And then the last book is the Cambridge History of Hellenistic Philosophy, which also came out in 2008. And that's a very well-packed companion. It does not include the original text, but it includes essays by scholars, philosophers commenting on each of the particular topics that are in there. So there are many, many good reference books. And I'm also going to underscore the fact that definitely you should refer to the primary text if at all possible. But as nobody has the kind of time to really go through it and like a scholar, it's okay if you rely a little bit on particular commentaries like the Cambridge History of Hellenistic Philosophy, because it's going to save you time. You get all of the arguments in one place instead of trying to comb through the text yourself and trying to extract it. So it just saves time.
And like we were talking about before too, in some cases, like depending on how old and especially how obscure a particular philosophy or philosopher might be, there might be little to no actual original sources.
That's right, particularly in the case when you're talking about ancient philosophers. Now, in Plato's case, we have the dialogues, and in Aristotle's case, we have the treatises. The interesting thing that scholars have pointed out is that it was likely that Plato had written long-form treatises, like you'd find in Aristotle, but those are lost.
Oh,
And by the same token, Aristotle might have written dialogues, but those are lost, just as some of the other books are. And what you find in the book, like Aristotle's Physics, you pick up that book, that was compiled over many centuries by scattered fragments. Aristotle didn't sit down to write a book in the sense that we would write a book now or in the past 100 years or so. They were just collections of treatises bound under this one particular title. And then if you go even further back in the case of the Stoics, or even the pre-Socratics or the pre-Platonics, depending on how you want to classify those, all those exist in fragments from
yeah,
what they came down to us. Like in Heraclitus, in particular case, there's just a small handful of particular fragments. There's no cohesive sense to it because they didn't intend to be cryptic. It's just that whatever else they wrote was lost. And so
yeah.
that's why relying on things like the Stoic Reader, since you're dealing primarily with fragments, is a really good resource to look at, because the scholars have compiled all of those with critical commentary.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, they probably tend to understand them better than the average Joe too. So it's probably easier for them to figure out, like piece these fragments together to get more of a cohesive view of whatever the particular philosopher was trying to say.
That's right. Also, for whatever the philosopher said, like going back to the Stoics Reader, you got what they said through other people. Like Aristotle had commented on the Stoics, Diogenes Laertius in the Lives of the Philosophers comment on the Stoics. So what you know about them is through a secondhand source anyway.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's important to remember too that a lot of philosophers can have the same name, especially like the ancient Greek philosophers, and I'm sure lots of other different types as well. Because I know I accidentally read a whole book by Diogenes Laertius, thinking it was by Diogenes the Cynic.
Yeah. Yeah, you definitely know that in your Roman history when you look at the emperors. There are a lot of Gaiuses and Marciuses, but that's not how you know them. Like Caligula is one of the famous Roman emperors, but his first name is Gaius. But Gaius was a common name back in the day.
Right.
That's where you
Yeah.
really have to get distinct with it. That
Yeah.
Diogenes Laertius is not Diogenes the Cynic. That's a different person.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. They're they're very different people.
Yeah. Okay. So with that out of the way, I also wanted to underscore one other thing about the Stoics themselves is they are in the period known as the Hellenistic period, and this was called
Right.
Hellenistic philosophy. So just briefly running this down, Hellenistic is a term that came in the 19th century with scholars to demarcate a period of history that is after classical Greece.
Oh, okay.
Classical Greece is referred to as Hellenic, after Hellas, which is the Greek word for Greece itself. And the Hellenic period is classical Greece, which includes Plato and Aristotle. Hellenistic starts from the death of Alexander the Great, when his empire that stretched all the way to the Ganges basin in India, was enormous, his empire. After his death began the period that scholars have referred to as the Hellenistic. So Hellenistic, in some respects, they describe it as a breakdown or an adulterated version of Greek culture, because it was a mix of Greek culture, classical Greece culture, with the Eastern views.
Oh,
So
I didn't know that.
that's when you're starting to get into things like Armenia or Persia, ancient Persia at the time, and even going all the way to India. So all of that was making its way back through Alexander's empire to mix with classical Greece. And then this became the Hellenistic period, which lasted until, depending on what date you want to place on the ground, from the defeat of Mark Antony in the Battle of Actium, in which Octavian became Augustus Caesar, and that was the start of the Roman Empire from around the turn of, I think it was 31 BC going into the first part of the AD, up until, or sometimes they say that it began with Constantine the Great when he founded Constantinople. So there's a debate on when that happened. But the important thing is that the Hellenistic period was an admixture of classical Greece and the Eastern philosophies, and that's where you find the Epicureans, the Stoics in particular, in that period. So
Right.
whenever you see the term Hellenistic philosophy, that's what it's referring to.
Right. So, do I remember correctly? I think two things that I thought of when you were talking there. I think I might have seen this in the sort of introductory information the last time I went through some books in the Bible, something about how Alexander the Great was supposedly the first person to write write a version of the New Testament in Greek, like as opposed to the languages it was before then. And also the period of Hellenistic philosophy, do I remember correctly that it was over like a certain period of time, maybe 300 years or so, but like you said, depending on when you decide it starts, or is that a different time frame?
Well, for the first part, the Greek is also important because it was Greek speaking. Hellenistic did not completely do away with Hellenic, the ancient Greek,
Right.
but it started to, what you were saying about Alexander the First to write it in Greek. I'm not sure about that, but definitely is when you would see the emergence of certain books of the Bible that were written in Greek. Now,
Okay.
ask any biblical scholar that's been doing it for a long time. They say if you were in particular in seminary or divinity school, you would study Greek, you would study Latin. Latin came much later,
Right.
but also Aramaic, and I think it was one other language. So
Hebrew?
yes, Hebrew, yeah, that's right. Hebrew is the Hebrew Bible. Then Aramaic was the language that Jesus spoke. But then the later translations that you have, first it was Greek and then it was Latin.
So Hebrew and Aramaic were supposedly the the first languages that the Bible was written in?
Right. You can't study the Old Testament in particular seriously unless you know Hebrew.
Right.
Yeah, Aramaic was kind of the common language. Jesus spoke Aramaic, as far as we know. He did not speak Greek, nor did he speak Latin, as far as we know either, because it was in Judea, even though Judea was a Roman province at the time.
Right. So why was it that it seems like for a long period of history it was the case, and I remember from hearing about Martin Luther, that one of the one of the things that happened during the Protestant Reformation was that he Martin Luther started printing Bibles in German, which was the local language there, and then priests, what they had been doing for a long time was reading the Bible in Latin with their backs facing the congregation, and they were facing the front of the church. So do you know why it is that that the Bible was in Latin and recited in Latin for such a long period of time?
Sure, because of the Roman Empire.
Oh, okay.
So Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire in 313 under what was called the Edict of Milan. That was Constantine. And so this is how Latin became the primary ecclesiastical language, and that continued into the Middle Ages. And so this is why you had priests that, were among the more educated of the people at the time. They knew Latin. They didn't necessarily speak it. They could speak the common language of the people, but they conducted the Mass out of tradition in Latin. And they read from the the Latin version of the Bible, of course. And so the commoners who were not that much educated, they didn't speak Latin. I mean, even as recent as like the 60s with Second Vatican Council, like my mom, when she, because I was raised Catholic, when my mom went to church, the priests were still reciting the Mass in Latin.
Oh,
How
wow.
that changed. Now, in the case of Martin Luther, as you said, his belief was you should make the Bible accessible to the common person. You should do away with the whole papal ecclesiastical structure. It's because that's just a very top-down thing. When the common person goes to church and they hear the priest reciting Latin, it's mystical, it's mysterious or whatever it is. And Luther's just like, that's a bunch of horseshit. You translate it into the common language, you can read it for yourself because it's a more personal one-to-one. Your salvation is based more on your personal efforts instead of a priest saying, yes, I absolve thee, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah, Martin Luther is for sure a really important historical figure. It's interesting too that I've been learning about a little bit more recently from Thaddeus Russell on his podcast about how puritanical Martin Luther and the Protestants and people like that were. And I remember from listening to my favorite episode of Dan Carlin's podcast, Hardcore History, called Prophets of Doom, that I forget what period of history it was, maybe the 1500s or something, but it could be something completely different from that. I remember hearing for the first time about the Anabaptists, who for them, the Protestants were not puritanical enough, so they had to get more that way.
Yeah, interesting take on that. Coincidentally, the Anabaptists are the ancestors of the Amish.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And the main thing about the Anabaptists is that they were against infant baptism.
Oh, okay.
Which is traditional in the Catholic Church. When you're an infant, like I was baptized.
Oh, okay.
I didn't have a say in it. It's just the tradition,
Yeah, I was baptized too. My parents were for most of my childhood, they were ordained ministers in the United Church, which is a Canadian Protestant denomination that I think it combines the Presbyterian and I forget the other two, but it combines three different Protestant denominations.
Probably Anglican was one of them.
Yeah, I think Anglican was one of them. Yeah.
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 You Canadians are Anglican.
Yeah.
No such church here in the States. It's Episcopal, more or less the
Oh,
same.
really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Anglican is what refers to the British Empire and the Commonwealth.
Oh, okay.
But homologous to that is the Episcopal Church, because you don't have the Pope, you have the Archbishop of Canterbury as the spiritual head.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Are those still is the Archbishop of Canterbury, does he still exist?
Oh yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's the
I
it's the
didn't
office. He is the spiritual head of the Anglican/Episcopalian Church.
Oh, okay. Oh, I didn't know that. That's
And just like the
interesting.
Patriarch of Constantinople is an office that still exists, who is the spiritual head of the Orthodox Church, even though the Orthodox Church is very decentralized.
Right, right. Oh, okay. Oh, that's
Okay.
interesting.
But I fear we're getting away from Stoicism.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay. All right. So I've said my piece about the materials that we're going to look at that I recommend. I also recommend the listeners take a look at too. I think they're very good, and there's many more. I mean, there's lots of books that have been written about the Stoics since then, critical editions, readers, commentaries, or whatever it is, and to set up the historical period about what Hellenistic is. So if anybody's interested in Epicurus, you're referring to Epicurean. Sorry, anybody who's interested in Epicurus, you're referring to Hellenistic philosophy. That's the period.
Yeah.
Okay, so
So, the was it that if I remember correctly, that like around that period there was the Socratic. No, wait, no, there was the. I think no, it was the Platonic school, and I think it was called the Peripatetic school, which might have also been kind of similar to the Aristotelian school. And then from that, you had Stoicism and Epicureanism, and I think Cynicism was one of them too.
yeah,
Is that correct?
that's right.
Okay,
So yes, after Plato's death, the Platonic Academy still existed for centuries afterwards.
right.
Also, after Aristotle's death, the Peripatetic school, which is the term they used to refer to that, applied to Aristotle's school. And coincidentally, peripatetic is also an English adjective referring to walking around,
Oh,
which
that's
was
interesting.
so they said is that instead of what you would normally consider is that somebody's behind a lectern addressing a class, that person is just walking around amongst the students. That's where peripatetic is.
That sounds like a way more productive and fun way to do school.
Yeah, and not to mention in the Lyceum, so they said is that that's how the instructors did. They just walked around the grounds, taking the students, having discussions instead of you're just lecturing to them in one static place.
Yeah, that sounds a lot better to me.
Yeah. So, yeah, with the Platonic and the Aristotelian academies, you also had the competition from the Stoics and other Hellenistic schools.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So you got some notes.
Yeah.
You want to dive in your notes?
Yeah. So, oh yeah, one of the this is one thing that I wanted to ask you about because I didn't quite understand what they meant when they were talking about it in the Stoics Reader book. I wrote down the Stoics believe in continuum. Epicureans believe in discontinuum. Like, is that a something in terms of sort of metaphysics and time? Like, there's a finite period of time in the Stoic view, and time is infinite in the Epicurean view.
Yeah, that sounds about right. The continuum is a central concept in Stoic physics.
Okay.
So if you think about what the contemporary meaning of the term a continuum is, it's a spread. Okay,
Okay.
you kind of have a starting point and then you have an end point, and the continuum is what exists between those 2 points. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the continuum is finite, that it has a beginning and an end, that it could be infinite. It's just the entire spread through that.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
that much, it's not that far removed from, again, what the contemporary meaning of the word continuum is when you say something exists on a continuum.
Right. Right.
Okay.
Okay. That makes sense.
Okay. But on that note, so I'm going to refer to another good resource of info, the Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy online. And there is a chapter there about the continuum. So
Okay.
I'll just go ahead and read the first paragraph here. So it says, matter is permeated by God. And we'll put that off to the side. We'll get to that later. And the passive elements by the active ones, which constitute pneuma, P-N-E-U-M-A, central term.
Oh, I remember that word. Yeah.
Yeah. So what is this permeation? Mere juxtaposition of particles, such as atomism posits, that's referring to the atomist school of Chrysippus and Leucippus, Democritus and Leucippus, could ever constitute the intimate causal link between God and the matter which makes the Stoic world an inherently and an ideally intelligent being. The active body must permeate the passive body through and through. Stoic theory distinguishes 3 grades of mixture. Juxtaposition, for example, of mixed grains conforms to the atomist model. So, the thing about atoms is not the contemporary meaning of the word atom, but in the atomist school, is that there are these things called atoms, the most indistinguishable and irreducible components of physical reality.
It's so interesting that they thought about those way back then in that time period too, like long before modern science.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And this was part of a theory. They didn't have any way to prove it,
Yeah,
like we did in a electromagnetic microscope or things like that.
yeah,
So with juxtaposition, you have separate atoms and they don't admix. You know, you can fast forward to like contemporary atomic theory. You break everything down to its atomic level and something else emerges from the combinations of atoms. For example, like water, H2O, one hydrogen
yeah,
atom, two oxygen atoms. So that's how water approaches. But in the case of juxtaposition, you're not necessarily having anything that emerges from that.
right.
Okay.
Yeah,
So in the Stoic theory, you have juxtaposition. The second one is called fusion, synkousis. That's the Greek term. It's a kind of interpenetration in which the ingredients irreversibly lose their distinctive properties and a single new stuff is generated. So going back to H2O, one separate hydrogen atom, two separate oxygen atoms, water is generated from this. This is fusion.
right.
Okay. Okay. In between these lies blending, called crosses, which also involves total interpenetration, but with the ingredients retaining their own distinctive properties. Okay. A helpful Stoic example. The fire which is seen to permeate a red-hot piece of iron may clarify how the two ingredients can be seen as literally coextensive, rather than alternating as in juxtaposition. It is blending that describes the relation of pneuma to the material substrate. Okay.
Okay.
Follow that so far?
Yeah.
Okay. Any comments?
Well, I was just thinking there, another interesting thing that I don't remember if I added it to my notes for this book or when I was writing notes on the Cambridge history of Hellenistic philosophy, this idea of this conception of fire in Stoicism as it being like basically the substance that creates the universe, and then when something is created, it keeps that energy of fire, but then some of that energy is taken from that to make new things, and it's kind of like an endless cycle of fire creating new things, and then a piece of that creating other things.
Right. So it's a I mean, you could fast forward to contemporary ways of looking at the universe. Okay, so if you believe in the Big Bang, you know that there was nothing before the universe and suddenly it just appeared. Okay. Or you could take the more ancient view, stemming back centuries and centuries, is that the universe, what they ever described the universe back then, had always existed. I think that was also Aristotle's take too, is that the universe had just existed. It didn't have necessarily a cause.
Yeah.
So in the Stoics' view, fire, the Greek term is pyr, P-Y-R, is the essential substance of the universe. And so there's always a sense of creation, destruction, and creation and destruction and creation and destruction. You also see this in the Hindu. The world is created, it is destroyed. The world is created, it is destroyed.
Yeah, I
With
was
the
thinking
with the
about how,
personifications of with Brahma, the three godheads, the Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Shiva is the destroyer, Vishnu the preserver, Brahma the creator.
yeah, Hinduism is something that I've been wanting to learn more about. I was thinking too about this whole concept of fire and the way you were describing it, how similar it is to like a lot of different conceptions of mythology. Like that's sort of a Buddhism thing too. Like it's this endless cycle, and it's like sort of reminded me of reincarnation in a little bit in that way as well.
Yeah, and the thing, as I mentioned, is that the universe, the world, had already existed, and it's never destroyed.
Right.
But shifting gears a minute and going over to the Judeo-Christian approach is God the divine, created the world out of nothing.
Right.
Okay, the Genesis.
Yeah, so the world did not exist before God created it in that conception.
Correct. But in the Stoic conception, it already existed. And pure is very important as the substance, the essential substance of the universe.
Right, exactly.
Okay. So going back to the Routledge dictionary here, I'll read the, let's see. Let me go to the second paragraph. So it says, division is to infinity, or infinite, according to Chrysippus. For there is not some infinity which the division reaches, it is just unceasing. And blendings also are through and through. This is coming from Diogenes Laertius. The doctrine of total interpenetration depends on the infinite divisibility of body, because if each of the blended stuffs consists of indivisibly small particles, these could only be juxtaposed and not further blended. Hence the Stoics are, like Aristotle, committed defenders of the infinite division on both mathematical and physical grounds.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so let's ponder that for a minute.
Yeah. So I understand how they could see that on physical grounds, but how would it be the case on like mathematical grounds? Like, were they just speculating philosophically in terms of mathematics back then, or were they actually doing mathematical calculations about that sort of thing too?
I think it was both.
Okay.
In particular, you associate mathematics with Pythagoras.
Right.
The importance of mathematics in his philosophy. So I would say that definitely in the physical and the mathematical, there are certain things in mathematical concepts or truths, loosely defined, that are indivisible or that can blend. You take two things, you take two other things, you now have four things.
Right.
You subtract one thing from two things, you have one thing.
Right.
So the import of that paragraph, quoting Diogenes Laertius, referring to the Stoics, is that there are blendings through and through. And so because there are blendings through and through, this emerges the continuum.
Right.
Because if you had individual components within the universe, you would not have a continuum. You would just have juxtaposition.
Right.
Okay.
That's also like a sort of idea that kind of reminds me about mythology and kind of Buddhism and stuff like that a little bit. It kind of makes me think about the idea of the interconnectedness of all things.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's definitely a good way to look at it. So the continuum is another way to express that interconnectedness of all things. But then also referring to what we understand of continuum in contemporary usage is that there are gradations of something.
Right. Yeah.
So you can have, like we could say in the case of a human life, you start from a baby, and then as you grow into something, that's not something indistinguishable. You start off as a baby, and then you're a toddler, and then you're a kid, and then you're a teenager, a young adult, a middle age, and you're going all the way until death. That's a gradation. You exist on a continuum.
Right.
It's not that you're a baby, then suddenly you become this, and then suddenly you become this. That would be indivisibility.
Yeah. And technically we're the same person throughout our lives, but we change so much that you can be like, we get classified into these categories of different ages, and we don't really necessarily know when this happens, but we all change, some people more than others, but change at least probably significantly for most people throughout our lives. And it's interesting to see us existing on a continuum in terms of that, because we'll be this type of person one way, and then maybe a few years later we'll think differently about ideas, or we'll look different physically, or we'll be in different relationships with different types of people, or anything like that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the continuum.
Okay.
Okay.
That makes more sense. Yeah. So, oh yeah, I also another thing that I wrote down here is, since it's on the topics of physics, one thing that I wrote down from my notes here is that Oh, actually, it was a thought of Epicurus, which is kind of related to what we were just talking about. Epicurus was talking about how everything is indivisible and interconnected. So I mean, I know the Stoics and the Epicureans disagreed about a lot, but I think that's an example of some agreement between them.
Yeah, in some respects. But again, the Stoics would have called that juxtaposition.
Right. Right.
So again, it's not to say that juxtaposition doesn't exist in Stoic physics, but that's not where the continuum comes from.
Right. Right.
However, as you notice, that the Epicureans did not believe in a continuum. Everything is indivisible. It's more of a core atomic type of philosophy.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, like the more I learn about this, the more complex and sophisticated it gets.
Right. Which is, as I said at the top of the conversation, is that when you spend time understanding more of the physics, when you get to the ethics, that's going to make a little more sense. Because if you
Yeah,
take the ethics, I mean, anybody can pick up Marcus Aurelius and read Marcus Aurelius, and it's an important text in Western literature, okay, for how to conduct oneself. But
meditations.
right, the meditations, how to
Right.
conduct oneself, that's more of the ethical and the lifestyle type of approach. But there is the underlying physics to that. Same thing in Plato and same thing in Aristotle. They didn't just dream this up out of nothing. They had their core physical and metaphysical um, theories behind that.
Right. Of course. Yeah.
Okay.
So oh, right. I also, but this is sort of in relation to what we were talking about in terms of fire earlier. This is another note that I wrote down. The Stoics said that the world is a combination of two bodily principles of matter and God, and
Mm-hmm.
they're always connected. So that's interesting too. That it's sort of, I mean, it sort of reminds me of the deist perspective in a way, that God is like everywhere and ever present or something like that. But I don't know, is that right, or how would there be a difference there?
Well, so from what I remember in reading the Stoics is that they were materialists through and through.
Right,
Okay.
right,
And so, what you're referring to is that God or the divine or whatever you want to call it permeates through everything. There's a term for that called pantheism.
right, right.
You particularly note this in modern philosophy with Spinoza. Spinoza's God is the pantheistic God, and he more or less equates God with nature, the physical nature.
Yeah,
So you're avoiding the transcendental approach to a deity. You're
yeah,
also avoiding the deistic approach because the deist approach is there is a transcendental deity, but it is separate from the physical world. The
right,
physical deity, the deity created the physical world. I mean, there's other ways that they refer to this. One of which is the watchmaker approach. So God, the divine, created the world as a watch. He set it off. It ticks away, but he doesn't. He does not necessarily have a particular hand in the operations of that clock or that watch.
right,
That's the core
right,
deist approach.
right. Yeah, that's an important distinction. Yeah,
So
God
when
is
you talk, so when you talk about the pantheistic approach, which is essentially what the Stoics are, then you're not separating God, the divine, from matter, from being embedded into the physical world.
right. So it's very different from the deistic perspective, in that it's obviously not that God created the universe and then stepped back, like it's that he's interwoven into the matter in the universe, like you were saying.
That's right, and also it implies is that the God or the divine does not have any kind of supernatural powers.
Right. Yeah. So this is why some, I guess, particularly Christians who I've talked to, who seem to have similar views to pantheism, like basically when I talk to them, when it comes down to it, it seems like their definition of God is like literally matter or the universe itself or something like that.
Yeah, so you could credibly call them pantheists.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's important that you brought up too, when you were just explaining there, the idea of living in harmony with nature, because I know this is a big important thing for Stoics, right?
Right, for sure.
Yeah,
Okay, so let's shift gears a minute and let's look at the term physis. The Greek
sure.
term physis is very important in Greek philosophy. You see it in Plato, Aristotle. So I'm referring to the Greek philosophical terms lexicon by Peters, and this is what he says about physis in terms of the Stoics. Stoic monism led to the identification of God, nature, fire pure. In its immanent active role, physis is logos, and on the level of the individual existent, the logoi spermatikoi. It is a moral principle in that the purpose of man was to live, quote, harmoniously with nature. For the Stoic, quote, natural morality and the theory of the interconnection of nature, see nomos and sympathia, respectively. Okay, so
Oh, okay.
let me unpack that for a minute. So you understand what monism is, the meaning of that term?
That's one thing I wanted to get you to clarify.
Okay, so monism means a one. So
Okay.
when you're referring to something, it's a one. Now let's look at Heraclitus and its Parmenides. Okay, so Heraclitus, the core tenet is everything is in flux. Parmenides is there is just one unchanging substance, whatever it is. So Parmenides is a monistic approach.
Oh,
Or
okay.
like in the terms of mind, all right? So you don't have a division between mind and body. You have everything is mind or everything is body. That's monism.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading a lot of different arguments about that, about how everything is body or everything is mind.
Right. So that's a monistic approach. You're not making a division into two or three or more.
Right.
Okay. So physis is logos. You know, and logos is an important term in lots of philosophy, but let's
We hear that a lot today too.
yes, we do. So let us move to okay. All right. So here's the entry on logos for the Stoics. The Stoic point of departure on logos is Heraclitus's doctrine of an all-pervasive formula of organization, which the Stoics considered divine. And there's a term for this called nomos, which is also the root of a term nomological, which refers to a norm.
Okay.
Okay, makes sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay. Logos is the active force in the universe, creative in the fashion of sperm. This is the logoi spermatikoi. Not sperm as in the sperm cell, but sperm as in it's a Greek term. It refers to like a seed.
Okay.
Something, it is a generating, um, it's a generating substance that sprouts. It's a seed. That's one of the best ways to look at it.
Almost
Yes.
sounds like the universe got created by masturbation.
Yeah, it did, didn't it? You probably wouldn't be too far off the mark.
Yeah.
Okay, creative in this fashion of sperm. As in Heraclitus, it is material and identified with pure. Let's see. This pervasive presence in the universe develops in several directions. Since it is a unity, it grounds the theory of cosmic sympathy, coming from sympatheia. Now, breaking down sympatheia as pathos is an important Greek term, which is an identification with. Sim
Okay.
is with. Okay, so if I am in the common usage, modern usage is if I am sympathetic to you, I can understand what it is you're feeling. I don't exactly feel that, but I can identify with it.
Right.
So the Stoic interpretation of this is sympatheia with the cosmos, identifying with it, living in accordance with nature.
Okay.
Okay. Grounds the theory of cosmic sympathy and of natural law and the ethical imperative to live according to nature. This is the nomos. Stoic linguistic theory further distinguishes interior logos, which is thought, and exterior logos, which is speech.
Okay.
Okay, a distinction that clearly identified Philo of Alexandria's notoriously difficult version of logos. Not important for right now, but it's important to focus on that distinction between subsequently when you're talking about logos, and this
Hmm.
is the root of the term logic. So logos could refer to mental operations, or it could refer to speech.
Right.
It's particularly in the Stoic conception of it. So the upshot of what I read there from that is that yes, the Stoics are very much into being sympathetic with sympatheia, living in accordance to nature,
Right.
which is also a somewhat divine nomos, a norm
Yeah.
one follows.
It sort of seems like with that understanding of logos, particularly in terms of speech, that sort of seems like it helps make more sense to me that if I understand correctly, the Stoics advocated more for political involvement than the Epicureans did.
Yes, true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, why that is, I can't say because I haven't read too much on that subject. The at least on the surface, though, the Epicureans were more concerned about a retreat from life.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you could even say it's Buddhistic or monastic, versus the Stoics, which were a little more motivated to become active in the affairs of society, the polis, and so on.
And it's interesting that they both kind of came from cynicism, and that Diogenes, if I remember correctly, like he was more for like leaving those, like retreating those things, and he would like live in a wine barrel and stuff, which, I mean, I don't mean specifically living in a wine barrel, but like retreating from society in a sense seems more like an Epicurean thing, like you were saying.
Yeah, to some extent, but you do know that in the common definition of a cynic, which comes from the cynics itself, which also comes from the Greek term kinos, which refers to a dog. So, Diogenes' whole thing was, I want to just completely remove myself from society to include comforts.
Right.
The Epicureans did not go that far. They just were more concerned about the individual. You're kind of living in accordance with nature, but the highest is pleasure, which is a loaded term anyway.
Right.
And not so geared towards lots of theoretical contemplation.
Right.
Because contemplation, theoria, was very important to Aristotle.
Right.
That kind of contemplation. Epicureans to some extent, but they were also concerned about the senses. So yes, you can enjoy fine wine, you can enjoy a fine meal, you can lie on the beach and things like that, but you're definitely not getting attached to it. This is why it really struck me way back in the day when I was reading about the Epicureans, how very similar it was to some Buddhistic approaches. Not the
Yeah.
monastic approach, but the term that is translated, I forget the Sanskrit term, but it's like the non-attachment. You enjoy what you have, but you don't become attached to it, that you crave it.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And if I remember correctly, like Diogenes wasn't necessarily like he didn't place pleasure as the highest good in the same way that Epicureans did.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But, again, even pleasure, this is why it's a loaded term. Later on, whenever was somebody referred to as an Epicurean, it almost made them, um, the implication was that the person was an aesthete or a hedonist.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
what's commonly referred to as an Epicurean, is that you're a hedonist. But even hedonism is a loaded term, because in a hedonism is that you're really overindulging in those pleasures,
Yeah.
versus you take it in moderation, sort of. You
Yeah.
can enjoy, and you're not depriving yourself of that as the cynics would. They didn't want anything to do with that.
Yeah. That's an important distinguishment uh, between Epicureanism and hedonism, because, like you said, yeah, those are different ways of seeing the world, and they often get kind of conflated.
Right. But in the Stoic sense, they were above all, it was living in harmony with nature.
Yeah.
Okay. So next note.
All right. So yeah, from where I was saying that the Stoics said that the world is a combination of two bodily principles of matter and God.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote down that they're always connected. I wrote down from there that there are four elements: earth, air, fire, and water, and
Mm-hmm.
that those are those are all reducible to matter and God.
Mm-hmm.
So that's I think it's interesting that it breaks down into those four elements, but they can all be traced to like basically being they're all produced by matter and God.
Right. Okay. So it's here's a good opportunity to go try to define what God means to them.
Yeah.
Okay. So again, referring to the lexicon, the entrance for theos, which is the Greek term for God or the divine. Let's see. Okay, so the first paragraph, this is instructive. So as a philosophical term, the divine, theon, different term, is much older than the notion of a personalized God. Indeed, there is among the philosophers a strong strain of skepticism about such anthropomorphized figures present in Greek mythology. You know what anthropomorphized means?
Yeah, like a human, like a physical presence, like a human.
Right,
That's an important distinct thing to underscore in terms of the conception of the Stoic conception of God.
right. Or even before then, this is before Plato. They did have a conception against an anthropomorphized figures as present in Greek mythology, mythos. So yes, you have the Greek gods of Olympus, Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and so on. But there was some skepticism about them, even then, even way back then. So even where the old mythological apparatus is used by the philosophers as Empedocles, who was a pre-Socratic philosopher, it is only to reduce the Olympians to natural forces. Okay. The
Okay.
earliest trace of a personal god in philosophical analysis is probably to be seen in the identification by Anaxagoras and Diogenes, not Diogenes the Cynic, also pre-Socratics, of intelligence, nous, another important Greek philosophical term, as a motive and purposeful factor in cosmology. Nous was, of course, divine, theon, and with its Milesian legacy of psyche, it could scarcely be otherwise. Where it fell short of being God was in its obvious lack of transcendence. Important point there. So, the upshot of that is, way back in the day when you had the Greek pantheon, some people believed in them literally, but the philosophers, starting from the pre-Socratics before Plato and Aristotle, were skeptical of this. They used the terms but only identify them as personifications of elements.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, and because of that, that didn't make the gods divine.
Right.
They didn't, and they were anthropomorphized, were personified. You know, each one of them was a human figure, male or female, but still they were identified as natural forces. So then, with a personal God, as he says, the identification of intelligence, nous, a purposeful factor in cosmology. So, nous was divine, but it fell short of being a God because it wasn't transcendent. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. So why was it seen as not transcendent?
I believe it's because it was. Okay, so I'll bring in a side example. Aristotle, when you come to the one treatise called the De Anima, which is an important treatise because De Anima is the Latin translation of, it's the Latin translation of the Greek, which I can't recall right now, but it is of the soul. That's how it's
Okay.
translated.
Okay.
But we're not talking about soul as some immaterial, incorporeal being that survives physical death. That's not necessarily it. Aristotle was referring to the anima as the life force of a
Right.
particular being, be it a man or a dog or any kind of a living thing. Even plants had an anima.
Right.
So the anima died with the physical body. Now, you could say that this anima was transcendent in a way, or
Hmm.
rather, it could have been divine, but it wasn't necessarily transcendent. Why? It's because it did not survive the physical body, but yet it was
Oh,
enough of an animating force, and anima is the source of the term animate. It is full of an anima or a life-giving spirit or whatever it is so it animates this particular physical thing.
yeah.
Now, nous is its own term. Nous refers to the intellect, and the intellect is a part of the individual, but the nous is not something transcendent. Make sense?
Yeah, that's interesting in terms of the conception of the soul too, because that's another thing that's tends to be different from the way it's commonly looked at today. Like it seems to me like the common way to look at the concept of the soul is that it is transcendent, like it keeps living on after your physical body dies.
That's right. Also, there's a precedent to that in Plato when he talked about the transmigration of souls. So the soul, whatever the reference was, fell from the ethereal realm into the body. It was trapped, and once the body dies, then return back to that ethereal realm.
Right.
That was Platonic. Aristotle with the anima is that it's the animating force, but it doesn't survive the body.
Right.
That's a main difference right there.
Right.
And so going back to the Stoics is that that's the core definition of what a theos is. Now let's jump forward to what the Stoics had to say.
Okay.
Okay, so let's see. Okay, so here's a section on the Epicureans. The Epicureans are not atheists. They admit the existence of gods, but deny their creation of the world or provident rule over it. Okay. Stoic materialism tended to thrust God back to the level of a Milesian theon, the divine. But their monism was not absolute, and their distinction between active and passive principles allows them to identify God as some sort of a creative, immanent element, and hence his, or rather its definition, as a creative fire, pir technikon. Okay, follow so far?
Right. Yeah.
Okay, nor were other more spiritualized implications absent. God is also logos and nous. The Cynics were probably the first philosophical school to make a systematic use of allegorical exegesis to reconcile a philosophically derived monotheism against popular polytheism. And in this, as much as else, they were followed by the Stoics. But it is clear that the monistic principle led to pantheism, just as the parallel movement on the level of popular religion was leading to henotheism and not to genuine monotheism. Seneca at least must be excluded from the Stoic pantheism, and possibly Cleanthes, whose hymn to Zeus does not read like a pantheistic tract.
So what's henotheism?
Okay, henotheism. Let's go to the term, henos. Where is it? Okay, it comes from the Greek term hen, the one. Okay, let's see. Anything about the Stoics here? Okay. Nothing on the Stoics, but you see it in Plato, you see it in Aristotle, Pythagoras, the Academy, especially in Plotinus, who's
Okay.
a Neoplatonist. We won't get much into him. So the one is, think of Parmenides in the one. Everything is all one. There is no change.
Monism.
Monism, right.
Yeah.
So what Peters is referring to in his entry is that there was a belief in henotheism is the belief in the one,
Okay.
but it is not monotheism. It is not the only one.
Okay.
Okay, make sense?
I'm not 100% clear on the distinction between monotheism and henotheism in that way.
Right. There's some subtleties for hen, the one, and Plato, Aristotle, and the rest of them. They each had their own difference. The different way they interpreted it. I would say it's probably the most often used with Plotinus. Now, Plotinus is part of what they call the Neoplatonic school, which came around the 3rd century or so, which was, when you look at it, you definitely could say, yeah, I could see how Christianity really took a lot from Plotinus, because it is the one, the unchanging. Maybe it's transcendent, maybe it's not necessarily, but it is not a god.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so yeah, it's a little difficult to try to draw a firm distinction between a henotheism and a monotheism, because we kind of understand what a monotheism is. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, lots of those things.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're believing in the one, rather in an undifferentiated substance. I mean, like, think of the universe. Okay, so the universe is a one. That's the hen. And there are many planets, galaxies, stars, or whatever it is that exist within the one. But you still have the one. It undergirds everything. Make sense?
Okay. Yeah.
And the hen, again, is not necessarily transcendent.
Okay.
Separate from whatever it created.
Oh, so that's one difference between monotheism and henotheism, is that there is transcendence in monotheism, right?
I would say it's implied, yeah, with
Okay.
monotheism.
Okay.
But again, I don't want necessarily go down that rabbit hole with Plotinus and Neoplatonics. Maybe we could do that another time.
For sure.
Okay.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's it for the Epicureans. It said as the entry stated, the Epicureans were not atheists. Okay. So that's an important distinction right there. Is, like what we have in today, there's many different ways that one could be defined as an atheist. You can say, I don't believe that there's a transcendent God, but I do believe that there is a one, that I do believe the universe exists,
Right.
and that whatever God is, referencing Spinoza somewhat, whatever God is refers to the universe and nature, pantheistic.
Right.
Okay.
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 Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. That was a kind of a long-winded explanation, but I'm also offering my interpretation of it too.
No, that was very helpful. So, oh yeah, one of the next some of the next few notes that I wrote here that I thought are interesting are I just wrote down what the way they were explaining incorporeals. So I was kind of like looking for specifically what something incorporeal is in comparison to corporeal, and it says incorporeals are place, void, and time. So it's interesting that that's like there's that much of a specific definition of what incorporeal means there.
Right. So you understand what incorporeal means?
Like before I looked it up, I would have thought that it means like non-living.
It could. Incorporeal comes from corpus, a body. Basically,
Okay.
it means existing without a body.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So what the Stoics referred to, what was the four? It was space, time, and what else?
Void.
And void. Okay,
Yeah.
so those are the three incorporeals. They exist, but they don't have a bodily form.
Right.
And when you think about it, space does not have a bodily form. A void does not, and neither does time.
Right.
Fast forwarding a little bit, you could say that, I'm thinking of Kant here. When you get to Kant is when you really start to get into space and time or categories of the mind. They exist, but they don't physically exist. Nor could anything exist unless it was in space or time.
Oh, that's interesting.
Okay. So this is one thing I noticed when I was getting into philosophy too. It's just like, wow, what Kant said about it being an incorporeal, didn't we not see this with the Stoics?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it is true sometimes when you think about it, what Alfred North Whitehead, an English philosopher, had said, that all of philosophy is but a footnote to Plato.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
Really wasn't anything new under the sun. You just shuffle the deck a little bit.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so what did you find about the incorporeals?
Well, that's I didn't find any more about that, at least that I wrote down in this specific place from the book. But there are other notes that I wrote down about, I think, void and time, but like I said, I didn't really organize my notes into different categories here. So I don't remember what else I wrote down about that.
Okay, so let's look at the Stoics Reader, to the glossary in the back. So void is keinon, that's the Greek term, containing nothing, having nothing real corresponding to it. In Stoic physics, the void is incorporeal and surrounds the organized cosmos.
Okay.
Okay. So
That's interesting that it's like outside of the existing cosmos.
Right. So the implication there is the Stoics had believed in a bounded cosmos.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I think it was the Epicureans who thought it was basically more or less infinite.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. So let's go to the lexicon and see what the entrance for kanon is, if it is in there. Yeah. Okay. Kanon, void, vacuum. Here's the entry for it. It says, a void is admitted by the Pythagoreans as a separating element between natures, and particularly numbers. It is attacked by Parmenides and denied by Melissus as sheer non-being. For both Empedocles and Anaxagoras, air is corporeal, and hence to be distinguished from the void, which is denied as non-being. The atomists embrace the Parmenides paradox and assert the existence of the non-being void, which together with the full, they make the new principles of the universe. It is discussed, defined, and denied by Aristotle. Kanon is affirmed by Epicurus as a good atomist, but denied by the Stoics.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
Yeah, that's interesting that there's disagreement about whether the void is corporeal or incorporeal.
Right. Or if it's non-being.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So the implication is that the void is something that exists with the outside of the cosmos. The
right,
Stoics didn't necessarily believe in it, affirmed in it, but it is the term they refer to outside of the cosmos.
right.
And the cosmos is the world, the universe.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay. So yeah, one of the next notes that I wrote down here is that Stoics disagree with Plato that souls, their virtues, and their vices are not bodies. So this seems like sort of a, based on what we were talking about, sort of a monistic conception, because it seems like there's I think I probably wrote this down explicitly somewhere else, but there's at least the implication here that that the Stoics thought that souls and the virtues and vices of souls are bodies.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Okay.
interesting.
Yeah. So let's go back to the lexicon. So let me see. Okay. So the Greek term for soul is psyche or psyche, which forms
Okay.
the basis of the word psychology.
Right.
But depending on who the philosopher is that talks about it, it can have many different meanings. So in the lexicon here, the Peters lexicon, it is psyche can refer to breath of life, ghost, a vital principle, a soul, or an anima, in the Aristotelian anima.
Okay.
Okay, so let's see. Looking for the Stoics entry here.
So in the Stoic conception, then would it be would a soul and the virtues and the vices of a soul be considered a body, whether you're looking at the Aristotle's conception of the anima or not, like, or whether you see as the soul is dying with the body or the soul is being eternal, it would still be considered a body in itself?
The psyche?
Yeah.
Possible.
Okay.
Okay, give me a second here. Okay, so there's a couple of entries in here referring to Plato and Aristotle and Epicurus. So I'll start with the Plato one.
Okay.
Plato frequently gives the impression that he is more interested in soul than in the soul. The proof of immortality already cited from the Phaedrus is set out to cover all soul. In the detailed passages in the Timaeus, however, where Plato describes the composition of the soul from its elements, it is the world soul, in Greek psyche tou pantos, to which he refers. The individual souls are second or third-rate versions of it.
Okay.
For Aristotle, however, it is the individual living being that is the paradigm and the method of approach as to investigate its various activities. In this way, he proceeds to an investigation of the faculties called dunamias of the soul of a living organism. Okay. Continuing. Plato had divided the soul into parts, and at times his language suggests that the parts of the soul are really individual souls within the same being. This is the tripartite division of the soul. If you read Plato, you know about the chariot, the charioteer, and the horses.
I don't recall.
Okay, so it's the tripartite of the soul is a precedent to Freud's conception
Okay.
of the unconscious, where you had the ego, the superego, and the id.
Right.
So the ego was like the sense of self. The id was the animal passions, and the
Mhm.
superego is what was trying to keep the ego in check and prevent
Right.
the id from overpowering the ego. So you more or less saw this in Plato with the tripartite division of the soul.
Okay.
And it's in the Republic. He describes it as a charioteer trying to keep two horses
Oh, okay. I've read The
on
Republic, but
task.
it was a while ago, so that's probably why I don't remember that.
Yeah. Okay, so Plato had divided the soul into parts. Aristotle calls them parts, but he treats them as faculties. Okay. That is, dunaimus in the world's primary sense of the power to effect change in another or in itself qua other. There are a great variety of these dunaimes, but they are the most appropriate way to study the nature of the soul. Aristotle proposes to work his way from the most fundamental, the nutritive thriptike, through the ascending series, each higher dunaimus presupposes the existence of the lower, to the sensitive, aesthike, and finally, and finally to the distinctive faculty of man, the noetike. Okay, so in other words, you have Aristotle retains the tripartite division, but he's putting it into the individual organism. So you have the nutritive, which is you're taking in food, you're taking in nutrients. That's one part of the organism. Then you have the aesthetic, which is the senses, in our case, the five senses. And then you have the noetic, which is intelligence, or the faculty of intelligence. Okay?
Okay.
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 Continuing. Aristotle is clear on the subject of personal immortality. Since the soul is the formal and final cause of an organically qualified body, it cannot survive the dissolution of the union with that body, except, perhaps, as part of the species, something I forgot to mention. But there is nothing to prevent a faculty of the soul from being separable. And this is actually so in the case of the nous. Okay? So, as I mentioned before, Aristotle doesn't believe in a transcendent soul that survives the body.
Right.
The only way that it does survive, in a sense, is in the species. So, reproduction is one individual, in the case of we humans, one individual human dies, but the species perpetuates, particularly if you've had children. And so the anima continues in your children.
That sounds like evolution.
Well, evolution is somewhat different. We're talking about the species itself, because the species could die out, just
Yeah.
as other species on the earth have died out.
Yeah.
But if you perpetuate the species, regardless of the quality of that species, because you could have, low IQ children, or you could have Down syndrome, or whatever it is, but the species continues, even though the individuals themselves will die off.
Yeah. I mean that, like, when you have children, your genes are getting carried on and that kind of thing.
Right. But the evolution is the changes that occur to the
Yeah.
organism.
Yeah, that's true.
But the species perpetuates. Just
Mhm.
want to make that clear. Okay. So there's nothing with the faculties of the soul. So let's fast forward a little bit, because you could describe this in modern language, is that when you talk about the mind, you're talking about its faculties. So you have the base faculties, you have the higher faculties, you have the whatever it is. So psychology, as it's practiced today, really takes a cue. It has its precedence from Aristotle. Faculties of nous. Also, Aristotle says that the nous could be separated from the body, the individual organism. The intellect can. That doesn't mean that the intellect persists, as does the species, but it could be separate from.
Oh, that's interesting.
Okay. So, but we'll leave that off to the side, because that's another rabbit hole we can go down there. Okay, continuing. So for Epicurus and Lucretius, soul is a composite body made up of various atoms. But this is a far cry from the mere aggregation of fiery atoms proposed by Democritus. First, the notion of body has been refined to that of an organic compound. Secondly, the relationship of the soul and the body is now specified as the atoma of the soul being spread throughout and contained within the sheath of the body. The atoma that go into the composition of the soul are no longer nearly fiery, but include breath, that's what pneuma is, and air. There is a more startling addition, the atoms of an unnamed element that are not like any of the others, but are subtler, smoother, and more mobile than any other kind of atom. It is this latter that begins the movements that are sensation and transmits them to the rest of the body. Okay, following so far?
Yeah, it's interesting that, well, like again, not only back then did they think of the concept of atoms long before modern science, but that there are different types of atoms too. That's interesting.
Right, and what prompts perception is the movement of those atoms.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting.
Okay. Okay, so now the Stoic theory of the soul illustrates the Stoic theory of soul illustrates the curiously qualified materialism of their positions. Important. Stoics are materialists. In a definition reminiscent of Heraclitus, the soul is material fire or heated pneuma, breath.
Right,
It has 8 faculties. The hegemonikon, which is the one that's above, that's the root of the term hegemony,
right,
a superior force. The 5 senses, and the speaking and generative faculty, each represented by a stream of pneuma stretched out to the appropriate organ and reaching back to the hegemonikon, and relaying to it the various sense impressions, phantasiae, impulses, hormai, and affections, pathae, to which the senses are prone. Okay, makes sense?
okay, yeah,
So, to summarize, is that pneuma is very important in any kind of Greek philosophy. It is the breath. In certain respects, like when you're looking at the pre-Socratics, and even there is a book that I would like to cover at some point, Francis Cornford, on how
okay.
Greek religion became philosophy.
Oh,
So the
interesting.
identification of the pneuma as the animating spirit, because back in the day, before you had microscopes and other sophisticated theories like that, when one had a breath, one was alive.
Right,
So then you identify the breath, the pneuma, as the soul, the animating spirit or force that is within the body.
right,
Okay. So then continuing is that the 8 faculties, you have the hegemonikon, which is the primary sense ruling over them all, the 5 senses, and then also they focus on speaking and generative. So speech is very important to the Stoics.
yeah, yeah,
So each represented by a stream of pneuma stretched out to the appropriate organ and reaching back to the hegemonikon. So you update it into contemporary language. You could say that an analog to this would be the brain as an organ is the hegemonikon.
mm-hmm.
The senses, particularly let's look at touch. When you touch a hot plate, the sensation goes from your fingers to the brain and back and prompts an action.
Yeah,
That's a contemporary way of understanding what the Stoic description of the soul is. However, the important thing is that they're materialists, so all this operates on the material level. Nothing
right,
transcendent about this.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Okay, makes sense?
Yeah, it sounds like again, like I've mentioned a few times, it sounds like oddly scientific for ancient philosophy.
Yeah, pretty freaky when you look at it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what else you got?
Sure. Okay. So yeah, another thing that I wrote down is I thought it was interesting that so the an individual is divided into substance and quality.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was interesting. Like it seems like, and I'm sure you'll have more to say about this, but it seems like it means that there's the substance of the individual, and then there's the qualities of that individual.
Right. Okay, so how did you understand that when you read it?
Well, the way I understood it is that like so there's the physical body of the individual and the atoms that make them up, and then the quality is that person's like personal qualities in terms of their intellect and that sort of thing.
Right, it could also refer to a physical object. So The thing about substance is because, substance, the English word comes from substantia, the Latin term, which in turn comes from another very important Greek term, ousia.
What's that mean?
So ousia is translated as substance or existence.
Okay.
Okay, so this stretches back all the way to the pre-Socratics, but referring to Peters's lexicon again, substance is particularly important for Aristotle, the ousia. Could be a physical substance or could be something else. So the entrant here is the Aristotelian category of substance as hypokemenon becomes for the Stoics matter. Ontologically, meaning referring to being, it is used in the same sense. Let's see. Yeah. So the primary substance for the Stoics is matter, physical reality.
Right.
That physical matter could have qualities. Okay. So
Oh, okay.
let's look at a physical object. So if you have a sword, that's one I can think of. A sword is made of what? Usually metal.
Yeah.
It could be steel. It could be aluminum. It could be bronze. Could be gold. Could be something else. So the substance is the matter itself from which it is made. But the quality is that it could be sharp. It could be dull. It could be heavy. It could be light or something like that.
Oh, okay. So the qualities could be seen as like the specific characteristics of an object.
Right. It's not that much different from how you would refer to it in contemporary language. Something has certain qualities.
Right.
Like your hat, for example, it has the qualities of certain colors. It's yellow, it's green, it's blue, it's soft to the touch, it's harsh to the touch. These are the qualities of the particular substance, which would be, my guess, is acrylic or some kind of cotton material. Okay, that's the primary substance.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I also wrote down here. You were mentioning the cosmos earlier, and I wrote down a few notes here just on the cosmos. So Aristotle's broad definition of the cosmos that I wrote down: good order or elegance, which is interesting, and it seems like in the context of the natural world, this meant the heavens and their orderly movements. And the Stoic and the Epicurean definitions are similar to this in that Epicurus said that the cosmos is referring to an infinite number of atoms in an infinite universe. And the Stoics said that the cosmos is an endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, kind of like what we were talking about earlier.
Right, with the Hindu version.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, the cosmos refers to the order of the universe, broadly speaking.
Yeah.
And that with Epicurus, because Epicurus was more of was definitely an atomist. It is comprised of atoms, and they are ever changing, coming into being, being destroyed, on and on and on.
Right.
Constant creation, constant destruction.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Like we were saying earlier, how it sounds like it can sound mythological, like Hindu or something like that.
Right, mythological, but also scientific and contemporary usage. Whereas you accept the atomistic theory that a particular form, like a vegetable in a compost bin. Okay, so you toss a banana into a compost bin, it has a certain form when you turn it into that. Over time, it will break down, so it no longer becomes a banana. However, that material itself still exists. It goes back into the earth, and then maybe at some point it becomes another banana, or it becomes some other plant or something else. So it's like the matter is neither created nor destroyed. It just takes on a different form,
Yeah,
based on whatever forces act upon it.
yeah, and like in terms of the cosmos, that reminds me of like the line that Neil deGrasse Tyson says, that we're made of star stuff because technically, like, stars exploded billions of years ago, and then their ingredients made new planets and interstellar objects, and then that process continued for billions of years until it led to us being humans today.
Yeah. So again, you look at the Stoics and you think, man, this is freaky shit.
Exactly. Yeah.
Imagine if you had Diogenes Laertius and Neil deGrasse's show.
That would be so interesting.
Today, my friends, we are going to talk about Stoic cosmology.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so what else you got?
So I also wrote that the later Stoics disagreed with this concept of the cosmos, because they thought that if the cosmos can, like, if everything is an endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, then when the cosmos dies before it is rebirthed, there would be nothing to do. So I thought that was interesting.
Say that one more time.
So they disagree. The later Stoics disagreed with that the cosmos is an endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, because oh, sorry, I missed I missed an important word there, because God would have nothing to do when the cosmos is dead.
Right. So I take that to mean that if you're looking at an impersonal universe, there would be no need for a divine, because what would the divine do?
Right.
However, the divine would be that force that is redirecting the cycle of birth and rebirth.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So the later Stoics disagree with that. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, like we mentioned earlier, that there's so much, like, the more you learn about any school of philosophy, really, like, you realize that how much disagreement there is between different philosophers and across time within that philosophy.
Sure, there is.
Yeah.
Well, on the subject of, well, we could shift gears a minute and go quickly over to Stoic ethics and the way of you conduct oneself in the world. So, summarizing everything we've covered up until now is that the Stoics were thoroughgoing materialists.
Mm-hmm.
They did believe in a theos or a divine principle, but it was not transcendent. They were, to some extent, atomists, particularly with Epicurus, although he was not a Stoic. And so, knowing this and if the point is to conduct oneself in accordance to nature, what does this look like? Okay, so before we can get to that, you were reading the Stoics for some time before we did this episode. So what were some of the main ethical principles, precepts that you drew from the Stoics?
Well, like you said, one of them is living in accordance with nature, and one aspect of it that's really important, I think, is that it's basically sort of a rationalist philosophy, that basically you can well, it's not that your emotions are damaging necessarily, but it's that, I guess, what the way they would be referred to is the passions. They are more damaging than your rational mind and your rational thoughts, so to speak. So it's more, you can better live in harmony with nature if if you try to be as rational as possible. But it's not that emotions are bad and you have to like avoid experiencing emotions, like this kind of common modern misconception of the word stoic, which it means like you're just like emotionally detached and tough and stuff like that. It's more that you experience your emotions, but then you don't get attached to your emotions, and you just move on with your fucking day without getting attached to the past, and sort of like living in the moment in that way.
Right. I could definitely draw a parallel to Buddhism with this.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Yeah.
so broad brushstrokes in Buddhism, you have the belief is that life is suffering. Okay. Although the initial Sanskrit term dukkha is often translated as suffering, although sometimes I think a better translation is more like discomfort.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So dukkha arises from the fact that you become attached to and you start to crave a certain state of being which is ever changing. So
Right.
you've lived long enough on this earth, you know that things are always changing. It's kind of a Heraclitean view, sort of. Things are in flux. Your,
Yeah.
your state of being now is not going to be the same a day from now, 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. How you were 5 years or 10 years before is not necessarily the same thing that you're having now, provided that, you could interject this here, provided that you take some kind of active involvement in the course of your life. But even if you don't, it changes anyway. You're not the
Right.
same person you was 5 years ago. So discomfort, dukkha, arises from the craving and an attachment to something. You could be attached to coffee. You could be attached to living on the beach. You could be attached to certain kinds of music and things like that. When those inevitably change and they pass away, then you go into a snit fit because it's gone. That's where the discomfort arises. That's where the dukkha arises. So
Yeah.
the rational, quote unquote, rational way to approach this is you cultivate a sense of non-attachment to it. Going back to an earlier point I had said about Epicurus is, yes, pleasures, kind of the highest, which is contemplation or time to sit and reflect. You can enjoy fine wine. You can enjoy that great cup of coffee. You can enjoy a vacation to the beach and all that. You just you don't go overboard with it and you don't get attached to it.
Yeah.
Detachment from it is also a form of discomfort because you're pushing it away. You're actively trying to keep it away from you, diverting mental energy to that, whereas it's better just to let it pass through. You can enjoy it or pay somewhat attention to it and just let it pass. Okay, you don't become attached to it. So that's a really good analogy to what the Stoics, at least the way you're reading it, is you act in accordance with nature, which is just redetermined as that it's ever-changing, birth and rebirth is emerging and destruction. And you live your life in accordance with that. You can have passions, you can have your emotions, but you don't let them get the better of you. You,
Yeah.
you sort of take a non-attachment approach to life.
Yeah. And like you were saying, that sounds like very Buddhist in a lot of ways too, particularly like the idea of mindfulness and detachment.
Right. The Stoics also very much influenced the Christians, the early Christian church, with a sense of rationalist or contemplation or a sense of detachment too. Now, maybe the Christians in some respects went a little bit overboard, particularly if you're talking about who were called the anchorites, the ones who retreated to go into the desert, subsist on bread and water and wear rags and things like that. Some of the early church fathers were like that. That's taking it overboard versus really mixing in Stoic philosophy with Christianity, which I think is an interesting subject for another podcast. How much did Hellenistic philosophy influence the early Greek church?
Yeah. It seems like, I mean, I don't know very much about that, but it seems like it definitely played a significant role.
Yeah, as did Greek philosophy. I mean, if you know something, you know enough about Christianity, the traditional way it's described. When you read Plato and Aristotle, you're just like, well, yeah, it makes perfect sense how what is in Christian doctrine would kind of emerged from that. An
Yeah.
immaterial soul, transmigration of the soul, um, the things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, for sure.
how could it not emerge from that? But there are many Christians who don't see the connection. But be that as it may.
Yeah, it's kind of odd to deny that as if you know like even if you've read a little bit of Plato or something like that, you can see that there's a lot of talk about God and the order of the universe and all that kind of stuff.
Hmm. Yep, for sure. It wasn't a personal God by any stretch, but
Yeah. Yeah.
okay. Okay, so I wanted to shift gears a minute and focus on just briefly the politics. So going back to the Routledge Encyclopedia, there's an entry in here on what's called the cosmic city,
Okay.
which the Stoics they were much more interested in politics than were the Epicureans.
Right.
So let's go into this. Let's see. Okay. Give me a second here. Okay. The cosmic city. I'll just read it verbatim. Everybody without exception strives for a good and happy life, but only the wise achieve it. Most people, in fact, misapply the very words good and happiness, which they mistakenly associate with morally indifferent states like wealth and honor. This simple point came to be extended by the Stoics to all the other things which are conventionally prized. Everybody wants to be rich, free, powerful, beautiful, lovable, and so on. But paradoxically, only the wise achieve these goals. Everyone else is, whatever they may think, actually poor, enslaved, powerless, ugly, and unlovable. This is because real wealth is to have something of genuine worth, that is, virtue, or to lack nothing that you need. Real freedom is to be in full control of your life, including the knowledge of when to accept death rather than to never be forced to do what you do not truly want to do. Real power is to be able to achieve everything you want. Real beauty is a quality of the soul, not the body, and only the genuinely beautiful are genuinely lovable. These Stoic paradoxes are of Socratic inspiration. That's the first paragraph. So
Right.
that, I remember this now when I was first reading Stoicism, is that this really encapsulates very well about how to conduct oneself in a Stoic manner.
Yeah, and the importance of virtue.
Right, which is definitely important in Aristotle.
Yeah.
And is the basis of later on what's called virtue ethics in contemporary 20th century.
Yeah.
Okay, so continuing. A primary motive of Stoic political thought is the extension of such paradoxes into the civic realm. Conventional political ambitions belong to the realm of the indifferent just as much as wealth and health do. Thus, while Stoicism actively promotes conventional political activity as a way of following human nature, it at the same time downgrades it in relation to true moral goodness. Everybody wants to have power and would like it if they could be a king, but only the wise have power. Only they can achieve everything they want. And kingship, defined as rule which is accountable to no one. These Socratic redefinitions are extended even to humbler civic aims, only to the wise generals, orators, magistrates, lawyers, and so on. An upshot of this was a corresponding downgrading of the civic institution within which such offices operated. A city, in the conventional sense of a human cohabitation with geographical boundaries, a legal code, and so on, is an artificial construct, a city in which the most correct sense is not constrained in these ways. In fact, the world itself is the ultimate city, being a habitation common to humans and gods, united by their shared rationality.
Okay. So maybe I'm getting this backwards, but it sounds like are they saying is that saying that like kind of placing nobility in politics and generals and the monarchy, or is it doing the opposite because of it saying that those are constructs?
Those are constructs, I would say, because
Okay.
in the Stoic way of conducting oneself, as the entry highlighted, is that one main thing is one's personal power.
Right.
Okay, achieving everything you want. Now, we know this as a fact is that nobody can ever achieve everything they want in life. Life is too
Right.
short, you're under certain limitations or whatever it is. But you're able to do this by clearly distinguishing constructs, false goals, with more proper goals. Okay, so those that get it, we could say, according to the Stoic sense, is they know how to construct and they conduct their lives in such a way where they don't need X, Y, and Z, even though modern society would tell them that they need X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And that they increase their own power and their own equanimity as they're conducting themselves in accordance with nature and in life, then you have everything you need.
Yeah, this is sort of reminding me how you can go back to Diogenes and the Cynics' view, in one thing that Stoics absorbed from them is this, like this idea that we were just talking about of detachment. So that the Stoics talk a lot about this idea of not being attached to riches or anything like that, and that if you pursue the highest good and if you have virtue, then you don't need those things to live in accordance with nature and live a good life.
That's right. But let me also interject what I had said earlier about, the Buddhistic conception of attachment versus non-attachment. It's a subtle distinction. So in detachment, you're pushing it away. Okay.
Right.
I don't need X, Y, and Z, and you're actively devoting your mental energies to pushing it out of your life. That is also contributing to dukkha, to
Right.
discomfiture. The
Right.
point is that, sure, if you or I won the lottery tomorrow, several $1,000,000, okay, we accept that. We did it because we did an action that led to that. Now, what you do to the money, that's a separate issue. But the money has come into your life. You're not trying to get rid of it. Some people would, but you don't necessarily have to do that. The point is that you don't become attached to that wealth. You
Yeah.
use it for other ends. Like, if we won the lottery tomorrow, we don't have to work.
Right.
But it's also incumbent upon us to construct our lives in such a way where we're not foolish with our money. We keep ourselves in good health, because you can have a lot of people that won the lottery and then they piss away their health, or they
Mm-hmm.
just piss the money away. You live in accordance with that. And so that relieves you of the burden to ever have to work for a living again. And it doesn't mean that you're never going to work again. You're just devoting it on something that's a lot more worthwhile.
And like you were saying before too, um, being detached from something, it means that if you have the highest virtue, then you don't have to, like you were saying, you don't have to expend energy, which leads to discomfort, trying to restrain yourself from being attracted to riches or something like that. It's just more of a sort of more of a kind of mindfulness kind of aspect with it, that it's just part of you to not be attached to those things.
That's right. And that's where virtue comes in.
Yeah.
So I want to quickly bring in Stefan Molyneux from this, is that in his early podcast, I really like how he made a distinction between how people operate by incentives versus by virtues. Because
Okay.
everybody responds to an incentive, but not everybody responds to virtue.
Yeah.
Those that are non-virtuous, you often see what happens to them.
Behave
So
more impulsively and whatnot.
that's right. So, and that's definitely not a stoicist approach to it, is that you don't want to become a slave to your passions.
Right.
But continuing with this entry for the cosmic city. Okay, so it's a city in the most correct sense is not constrained in these ways. In fact, the world itself is the ultimate city, being a habitation common to humans and gods, united by their shared rationality. Okay, so they don't find it as a conurbation, just a collection of people in one geographic area. The idea was of Cynic inspiration, interestingly enough. The Cynics had already coined the expression citizen of the world, which in Greek is cosmopolites, which the Stoics took over. Interesting origin of that term. In a way, every human being is a citizen of the world, and this generous version of Stoic cosmopolitanism was to become enormously influential on the ideology of the Roman Empire, as well as leading some Stoics to challenge entrenched gender and class barriers. But on a narrower criterion, influenced by Zeno's early utopian work, this is Zeno of Citium, one of the earliest Stoics, it is not all human beings, but only the wise who participate in the real cosmic city. The cosmic city has its own law, a natural moral law defined as right reason, which commands what should be done and forbids what should not. This notion of a cosmic moral law, which transcends local legal codes, exerted a powerful influence on later theories of natural law. Although the Stoics encouraged political involvement in conventional cities and were themselves prepared to act as advisors to monarchs, there is little reason to think that any Stoic before the late 2nd century made a serious contribution to non-utopian political theory.
Oh, that's interesting. So it came later than I thought it did.
Yeah.
That's it. That's interesting that you brought up that definition of cosmopolitanism too, because it's like if you have if you're more virtuous, it's better to be it can allow you to be more cosmopolitan in that sense. I remember the last time I was talking to Bill Ferriolo, who's a philosophy professor I've talked to a few times on my podcast. He was talking about that definition of cosmopolitanism and how it's different from our modern conception of it.
That's right. So the key point here is that the modern conception of cosmopolitan is you're a citizen of the world. You don't have any allegiance to a particular tribe or to a nation. Not a nation state, but a nation as in the German nation, the German people, the Italian people, the Indian people, whatever it is. That's as a cosmopolitan. But that is more in the contemporary sense of, it's very much tied up with globalism, which, the last time we talked on our podcast was, Zygmunt Bauman was very critical of globalism, leading to postmodernity, the ill effects that come from that. But in the Stoic sense, the citizen of the world applies to the ones who are the wise, who live by virtue. So if you are wise, if you are virtuous, you already are a citizen of the world, because that, in a certain sense, transcends what your local habitat or your local strictures are. So you're Canadian, I'm American, but we are part of the wise and the virtuous. We are already citizens of the world, and this is where the cosmic city comes in. So as the cosmos is the world, the wise inhabit this cosmic world, and the city itself is that world. Make sense?
Yeah. Oh, is that related to how, like, how if you're wise, you can transcend your circumstances? Is that related to what you mentioned about how you can transcend gender and social classes?
Yes, that's what they were referring to. So males or females could be wise. There's not a distinction between only males are wise and females are inferior males type of thing.
Right.
The Stoics did away with that.
Right. And class too.
And class too, right.
Yeah.
It made no difference that if you were a king or a peasant, each could be wise and therefore live in that cosmic city.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's what the cosmic city is. And then two other things we could cover. Let's cover the passions and fate.
Sure.
So passions we had touched on before. Again, I'm referring to the encyclopedia. So quoting, everyone who has not achieved virtue is in a state of vice or moral badness. Most commonly, for example, in the work of Plato and Aristotle, vice was viewed as a state in which reason is dominated and deflected by strong irrational emotions, or passions. But Socrates had established an enduring intellectualist alternative, according to which the soul has no irrational parts, and virtue is knowledge, so that its lack, vice, is simply ignorance. No one does wrong willingly. The Stoics are fully committed to developing Socrates' position, in particular the thesis that passions are really value judgments.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
That's interesting. So it's this sort of idea in rationalism, basically, that everyone is inherently rational.
Right. So in the second paragraph, it addresses this. A passion is commonly thought of as disobedient to a reason. Reason says that you should face some danger, but fear disobeys. Reason chooses to abstain from embezzlement, but greed wins out. This suggests that an emotion can hardly itself be a rational state. The Stoics accept the description of emotions as disobedient to reason, but redescribe what this amounts to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense with the Stoic conception of that.
Right. Okay. So continuing. The four main kinds of emotion are appetite, fear, pleasure, and distress. Appetite and fear are faulty evaluations of future things as good and bad, respectively. Pleasure and distress are corresponding misevaluations of things already present. Each has a variety of subspecies, and one of particular importance in Stoic discussions is anger. Seneca wrote something on this called On Anger, identified as a species of desire, namely the desire for revenge. Calling pleasure a passion and a vice may sound harsh, but the kind of pleasure envisaged here is one involving conscious evaluative attitudes, such that its subspecies include gloating and self-gratification.
Right. So
Okay.
so in that conception of the Stoics, then they're like, basically, would you say it would be accurate to say that you're inevitably going to like experience those passions, and it's not that we should try to completely eliminate them, but we should try to adhere to being living in accordance with nature, which would be to be as rational as much as possible.
Right. I would read into that is you have passions regardless. You can't deny
Right.
them. But that doesn't mean you give in to your passions.
Right.
This point about anger is that anger is a species of desire. It's a
Hmm.
desire for revenge. Somebody has wronged you, you want to get back at them. Now you could do that. That's giving into your passion. But would that be wise to do
No.
that? Because you don't know what the adverse consequences to that would be, any kind of a blowback.
Yeah.
I get pissed off at you, I take a gun and I shoot you in the head. Okay, so my desire was to exact revenge on you. But now I have just taken your life, which means if you had a family, I've just robbed the family of one of its people, and it would be
Okay.
negative consequences for me, according to the
Yeah,
law.
exactly.
So giving into that passion was unwise.
Right.
Now the entry continues. It should not be inferred that a Stoic sage is feelingless. The wise lack the passions, which are overvaluations, but they do instead have the correct affective states, which the Stoics call eupathia, or good feelings. Thus, the sage has no appetites, but does have wishes, whose species include kindness, generosity, warmth, and affection. Similarly, instead of fear, the wise have watchfulness, and so on.
Okay. So what's the instead? So what is watchfulness in that context?
So I interpret this as there are the passions, but it doesn't mean that the Stoic is feelinglessness.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not that like that modern misunderstanding of Stoics, and in that you're just emotionless.
Right, the common misconception. No, the Stoic is not emotionless. They do have emotions, but they cultivate what are called the good feelings instead of the base passions or those kind of over evaluations to things. Okay, so
Yeah.
like in the case of watchfulness with fear, fear prevents you from doing something,
Mhm.
usually. Now it's a very understandable and it's a hardwired response that we have to something that is unknown that might cause us danger. But instead of giving into your fear, you just become cautious, watchful for something.
Mhm.
If you're going to go into a dark wood, for example, fear would keep you from going into the dark wood. But watchfulness is you bring a flashlight, you scan the area, and you listen very carefully, and you're continuously watching to see if there's any movement as you're slowly going into that dark wood.
Right.
Okay,
This
makes
is
sense.
this whole understanding of these topics is why I still appreciate Stoicism, even after I learned, like, through more modern science like biology and psychology, that humans do not actually behave rationally, and we're basically like we rationalize our intuitions, because even if you know that, it's still a good idea, I think. At least it seems really effective for me and a lot of other people. And like, similarly to Buddhism, one of the goals behind meditation is to kind of be more calm and be more stoic in the proper sense, so that you're not trying to deny your emotions, but you're trying to just kind of get to the point where you don't get carried away with them. Like you were saying, you don't get reactive with your anger, or even reactive with your passion. Like, in the opposite way of anger, you could get reactive with your passion, and then like if a girl shows the slightest interest in me, I just want to leave my life and start a new life with her instantly, just because she shows the slightest degree of interest in me, or something like that.
Yeah, so it's trying to cultivate, no, for lack of a better term, mindfulness.
Yeah, exactly.
You can feel the emotion, but you're not, as the Stoics say, over evaluating it and acting rashly based on that
Yeah,
passion.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so with the last paragraph, this sums it up nicely. It says, the Stoics' conviction that emotional states, far from being mere irrational drives, are primarily specified by their cognitive content is one of their most valuable contributions to moral philosophy. It is most important implication in their eyes is that...
Your audio got cut off for a few seconds there.
Oops.
Just like, I can still hear you, but I mean like 10 seconds ago, I missed like 5 seconds of what you said.
Okay, I must have hit my button by mistake. Let me start again. So the Stoics' conviction that emotional states, far from being mere irrational drives, are primarily specified by their cognitive content is one of their most valuable contributions to moral philosophy. Its most important implication in their eyes is that philosophical understanding is the best and perhaps the only remedy for emotional disquiet. In the short term, strong emotions are disobedient to current reasoning, but in the long term, rational therapy can restructure the intellect and dispel all passions. Now, this, I think, forms the basis of what is called rational emotive therapy, RET. You ever heard of that?
No, but that sounds a little bit like CBT, like cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah,
Is
cognitive
it?
behavioral therapy. RET is another term to that. So it's clear that CBT really has precedent in the Stoics. So
Yeah.
to really try to redirect yourself is sort of framing your passions intellectually or cognitively and really reflecting on what it is that you feel, preventing an over-evaluation and preventing a rash decision based on that passion.
Right.
That's the Stoic way.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what they have to say about the passions. And moving right along, let's look at fate. Okay, so fate is very important in the Stoics. So
Yeah.
not only do you have the common misconception is that the Stoics don't feel anything, but also you have the notion, the understanding is that the Stoics resign themselves to fate. Okay, well, what does that mean for a Stoic? Let's see. So, yes, reading. Socrates had been a firm believer in the powers of divination and in divine providence. Stoicism took over this outlook and developed it into a doctrine of fate, which by the time of Chrysippus had become a full-scale thesis of determinism. Okay, determinism being everything is predestined, no
Right.
free will at all. That everything happens as predetermined is a thesis which flows easily from all three branches of Stoic philosophy. Ethics locates human happiness in willing conformity to a preordained plan and treats the use of divination as a legitimate means towards this goal. Physics provides the theory of the world's divinely planned cyclical recurrence, unvarying in order to maintain its own perfection. Physics also supplies a fundamental principle, regarded as conceptually self-evident, that nothing happens without a cause, no randomness. This quickly leads to the conclusion that the world's entire history is an unbroken causal network. Fate is a natural everlasting ordering of the whole. One set of things follows on and succeeds another, and the interconnection is inviolable. The passage of time is like the unwinding of a rope, bringing about nothing new and unrolling each stage in its turn. A modern analogy might be the continual rerunning of a film. Finally, logic offers the principle of bivalence. Every proposition, including those about the future, is either true or false. Therefore, Chrysippus argued, it is true now of any given future event either that it will happen or that it will not happen. What does that present truth consist in? It can only lie in the causes now present, sufficient either to bring the event about or to prevent its happening. Therefore, all events are predetermined by antecedent causes, sufficient to bring them about and to prevent all alternatives for occurring.
I think this is why Sam Harris likes Stoicism, because of the determinism.
Yeah, I think so too. However, it is an interesting notion to kick around.
It
So part of the definitely a major reason why I wanted to cover the physics in the Stoics is that this undergirds the ethics and the way they conduct themselves. So
is.
act in accordance with nature, which also implies a sense of determinism.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is reoccurring. Now, something I forgot to mention earlier on is, where do you see something about the eternal recurrence?
I don't know.
A much later philosopher, very well-known one.
Yeah, I don't know. There are too many for me to think of one specifically.
Nietzsche.
Oh, yeah, yeah, of course, yeah.
So Nietzsche talked about the eternal recurrence.
Hmm.
Was it a metaphysical principle? Hard to say. More like an analogical principle. But
Yeah,
he also was very important. He was a very firm adherent to what was called the amor fati, the love of faith, the love of fate. You accept
yeah.
one's fate.
Which is it's interesting uh, because Nietzsche was not a big fan of religion, and the idea of fate. It seems like kind of a religious idea.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that.
I just mean like in the sense that there's a divine order or something like that. But I mean it's like you said, the Stoics didn't necessarily look at it that way.
Right. You have to be cautious when you talk about religious because the implication is that there's some kind of divine providence, which, according to the entrance here, is that Socrates did accept divine providence, that there was an intervention by some kind of a divine entity.
Hmm.
So it's possible that could happen, but the Stoics were more, shall we say, quiescent about this. Is what will happen, what will happen. That also figures into the living in accordance with nature,
Yeah.
which is, you know, you could say is that there is only so much that one can do to bring about or to prevent a certain action from happening,
Hmm.
if you can control it. But you hop on an airplane and you're flying across to London from, say, Calgary, you don't have any control about what happens to the plane.
No.
If the plane is going to go down, the plane is going to go down.
Yeah.
So the
It,
Stoic would say you are living in accordance with what will happen, what will happen. If
yeah.
it's not going to happen, it's not going to happen.
This reminds me also of the Stoic idea of focusing on things that are in your control and not focusing on things that are outside of your control. So if you're in your example, if you're afraid of flying or something like that, then the thing to remember would be that you have no control over how this plane is flying, whether it's going to land and stuff, and you need to rely on the pilots to be able to land the plane, and there's nothing you can do about it. So there's no sense in getting like insane with worry about it.
Right. So there are some things you could do about it. Number one is you could not fly. You could take an
Yeah,
alternative mode of transportation. And that's why some people will drive for hours on end rather than fly.
yeah,
Or the only thing, just like with anything else, the only thing that you can control is your own response to it.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah. So this is where you have to be careful about determinism, is that I don't necessarily read into the Stoics a core determinism, although it kind of implies that it is, but that the determinism is not a mechanistic determinism, which is your reaction to something is preordained.
right.
What will happen in the cosmos and reality, the physical world. But if you are of the wise or of the virtuous, you do have some control over how you respond to that.
Right. Is this more of the idea I was reading about in Hellenistic philosophy of kind of soft determinism, in that there are causes that lead to occurrences, but those cause like it's not necessarily, like you were saying, like a kind of a direct correlation between this cause and this thing happening. It's that these things happen and there are causes, but these causes are not necessarily directly tied to the way things occur.
That's right, and it's good you brought that up. That's a contemporary term: soft determinism versus hard determinism. Hard determinism is there's no free will; everything is predestined,
Hmm.
preordained. Soft determinism is, yes, everything has a cause, which is what the Stoics assert. Everything has a cause, but cause A, B, and C won't necessarily cause event X, Y, and Z. When the cause is set in motion, there will be an effect to this, but the effect might be positive or the effect might be negative. Also, you could say is that the Stoics might, I mean, I think this is in Stoicism, I don't know exactly for sure. The event of that cause is also something subjective. You could say it's good or bad, depending on, to quote the line from Hamlet, things are neither good nor bad, but thinking makes them so.
True.
The point is, the way one conducts oneself is that you do not give in to the passion. If the outcome of what happened is not to your liking, you don't get all bent out of shape.
Yeah, exactly.
You're quiescent to it. Well, this happened, so how do I respond to this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because you can't change the past. There's the idea of mindfulness again, basically.
That's right. Okay. So then one of the last things I want to cover is about responsibility. Okay. So continuing. The greatest interest of this determinist position, it lies in the Stoics' attempt to meet the challenge it poses to moral responsibility. They implicitly accept that a person is responsible for an action only if they could have done otherwise. But how could this latter be true in a Stoic world where the actual action performed is causally determinative and predictable in advance? Fair question. Chrysippus was the author of the main Stoic answers to this challenge. His task was to show that even in such a world, could have done otherwise makes sense. An action which I did not in the event perform may nevertheless have been possible for me. That is, my failure to perform it was not necessary. The strategy for securing this result included the following lines of argument. Okay, so you understand what that means there?
Yeah.
Okay, so if I could have done otherwise, then I'm morally responsible for this.
Mm-hmm.
If I am not, then I'm not morally responsible.
Yeah.
So even though there is a deterministic streak, a soft deterministic streak in Stoicism, one still has a moral responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not like you're a slave to your fate, so there's nothing you can do, so there's no point in making decisions or anything like that. Like you said, how the difference between hard and soft determinism is that with soft determinism, you still have free will.
That's right. So let's bring in a really good example as a situation in war. Okay, so you're a soldier and you're shooting at the enemy, and you use a 50 caliber machine gun. Okay, you fire into a market square, you see the bad guys, you kill the bad guys, but then you kill some civilians as collateral damage. Now, in the Stoic sense, they would say you are morally responsible for that because you could have done otherwise. You could have not fired, you could have not been there, you could have retreated, or you could have been more selective in your choice of weapons and picking out the bad guys and not killing civilians.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Now, of course, in the laws of warfare, there are ways to exonerate somebody from that. I mean, they're collateral damage, and then you dehumanize the people that's just, they happen to get in the way, but not in the Stoic sense. You were still, when you shot, you were morally responsible for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, here we go. The strategy for securing this result included the following lines of argument. Number one, a possible proposition is defined in Stoic sources as one which admits of being true and is not prevented by external circumstances from being true. For example, suppose that you have failed to pay a bill despite having the cash. Paying the bill was possible for you. It admits of being true. There is such a thing as paying a bill, unlike, for example, being in two places at once. Nothing external to you prevented you. You did not lack the funds, you were not forcibly detained, and so forth. This account of possibility does not allow that something internal to you, may indeed must, have prevented you from paying. For example, your meanness, forgetfulness, or laziness. Still, it was possible for you to pay, in the sense that you had the opportunity to pay. Chrysippus seems to maintain that the could have done otherwise notion of responsibility holds in this world, because alternative actions are possible in just this sense. We regularly have the opportunity to do otherwise, and therefore have only ourselves to blame for what we actually do.
That makes sense. Yeah, like this is one thing that I like about Stoicism too, in that sometimes I've known people before who I've had friendships with them, and I've basically become less of friends with them because I've found out, oh, you're the type of person who blames other people for your problems and you don't take responsibility for your own faults and work on improving those characteristics in yourself. Instead of doing that, you just say that other people are conspiring to fuck up your life.
That's right. Well, what you know about Stoicism is a good counter argument to that. When
Yeah,
somebody tries to foist the blame off themselves, you say, well, could you have done otherwise?
yeah, exactly.
Were you an invalid? Or, as the entry says, is that it's possible that a character flaw, for lack of a better term, is what's preventing you from doing this. But you
Yeah,
still could have done otherwise.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that can be hard to realize for anyone sometimes too. Like we get into these patterns of behavior and we think that the way we behave is the only way that we can. And then if you think about it, you realize, oh, there's an easier way out of this than I thought. I can just make different choices and behave differently than the way I have been.
Sure. And that's not to say that you you couldn't chicken out and take the easier course of action.
Of course.
Just don't try to deflect the blame from yourself,
Yeah. Yeah, of course.
because you could have done otherwise.
Yeah.
So continuing, a second form of argument is, much as this same point was also expressed in terms of a causal distinction, one among many the Stoics were accused of introducing a, quote, swarm of causes. When a cylinder is pushed and rolls, the principal cause of the rolling is its shape, the push being just the triggering or proximate cause. From our point of view as agents, Chrysippus argues, fate functions as a series of mere triggering causes, the openings, provocations, and so on with which the world presents us. Given our respective states of character, we are bound to respond to those prompts in just the ways we do. But the principal cause lies in our character, and that makes us, not fate, responsible for our actions.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah. So that makes it like it seems with this like with the way you described it, it seems like this conception of fate, similarly to determinism, is almost more of like a soft fate rather than hard fate, similar to soft determinism rather than hard determinism.
Right. So the next paragraph discusses this nicely. It says, importantly, the Greek word for a cause, aition, literally means the thing responsible. However, the Stoics' technical term for moral responsibility is ephemin. Our actions are within our power. This is not a thesis of free will. What matters to them is not to posit an open future, but to establish the moral accountability of human action even within a rigid causal nexus.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so key thing is this is not a thesis of free will.
It's a thesis of responsibility.
Of responsibility, right. So even if the world is rigidly deterministic, what will happen, what will not happen, that doesn't absolve us from acting, because we're always acting with the world. Okay, the world presents actions, it does not present actions, it presents choices to us. We do this or that. And so the burden is more on the person for the moral responsibility. Sure, you have a shitty day, something happens, is like you get buried in an avalanche. Okay, there was nothing you could do to control that, but could you have done otherwise?
Mm-hmm.
Were you morally responsible, in a certain sense, of not being there when the avalanche happened? And in a way, this really harkens back to, existentialism kind of harkens back to Stoicism in a way, particularly when you're looking at Saut in the terms of decisions, freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how much you've studied about Saut, the concept of the mauvaise foi, the bad faith.
I know nothing about that.
Well, okay, so in brief is that Saut kind of echoes a lot of the Stoic sentiment, and that there is the world, and that you have the agent's actions in that world. So bad faith is one retreating into a particular role to escape responsibility for one's freedom, because one is at the core free. If you accept that one is sort of unconditionally free, there are many actions you could partake. Let's go back to the war example. You could choose not to be there, which means that you could have chosen not to enlist, or that you could have chosen in such a way as to not to be drafted if you were such drafted. So you find yourself in that situation, And then whatever the qualities of your character, like you have a hair trigger, and metaphorically speaking, you shoot into that crowded marketplace and then you kill civilians. Okay. That's kind of a default of your character. So your actions were somewhat determined, but then you still have the responsibility for that. Make sense?
Yeah.
And bad faith is you're just retreating into a role. It's like, well, I didn't know, it wasn't my choice to be in this situation or whatever it is. You're just deflecting the responsibility away from yourself.
Right. So in that sense, with the way you were describing it, then it sounds like acting in good faith means taking responsibility for your actions.
Right. You accept the fact that there's freedom. And even if the world is determinist, you still have that responsibility if you could act otherwise.
Right.
Even to yourself, because if you've lived long enough on the planet, you've done many actions that are not necessarily kind to yourself.
Yeah, of course.
Or responsible to yourself. But
Yeah.
you only have yourself to blame.
Yeah.
For those actions.
That's why, like, that actually reminds me of my own behavior too, because I've I have a tendency to just become an insane and obsessed workaholic. And one thing that I've literally thought about in a way that's been helpful to me about that is basically taking responsibility for the way I look at the idea of work and the idea of how I spend my time, and that I can make different choices. I can be responsible for making different choices and literally relax it, literally enjoying life more and working less so that I can be more happy and more psychologically healthy.
Right. Unless you enjoy your work.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you're, and I mean, I enjoy some types of work too. Like I enjoy, it depends on how you classify it too. Like I enjoy doing things like this right now, like talking with you, or any form of creative expression, like writing and stuff like that. It doesn't feel like work, but then I can get carried away and spend 5 hours doing that, and then by the time of the end of the day, I don't have time to do all the other stuff I wanted to do, or it's it's this idea of balance, really, which is sort of a Stoic idea too, in a way.
Yeah. Again, living in accordance with nature.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So then the last line of argument here is one remaining challenge was the lazy argument. Why, its proponents asked, should we bother to make decisions if the outcome is already fixed? Fair question. Why call the doctor if whether you will die or recover from your illness is already fated? Chrysippus' answer is that such sequences of events as calling the doctor and recovering are co-fated. In most cases, the outcome is fated via the means, not regardless of them. Such landmark events, however, such as the day of your death, may be fated regardless of the means. Your character will cause you to decline numerous alternative actions to those you will choose. But even if, counterfactually, you were going to choose one of those alternatives, it would still be going to lead to your death on that same day. For example, Socrates, in Plato's Crito, knew through a prophetic dream that he would die in 3 days' time, and his reasoned decision to stay and accept execution was willing cooperation with the rational world plan, where a bad person would have resisted by escaping but still died on that same fated day. Zeno and Chrysippus compared a human being to a dog tied to a cart. It can follow willingly or be dragged.
Okay. Okay. So it seems to me like it's about you accept your fate and you accept your impending death, but based on your choices, you can live a better life in that interim between your birth and your death.
That's right. You've heard that saying, which comes from literature, the coward dies a thousand's death, the hero only once.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a matter of how do you want to die, as a coward or a hero?
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't matter that either person is going to die. It's how will you do it? And so this is an exhortation to try to get your own personal house in order, to make better choices in your life, understanding that one makes mistakes and that things are kind of fated. but that you live as full or rich and as a virtuous life as you possibly can.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. And the last paragraph. In this way, morality is not simply argued to be compatible with determinism, but to require it. Only within a framework of rational predestination can moral choices have their true significance. There remains, however, the question why, in a world where it was preordained that we would be precisely the kind of people we are, our choices should have any moral significance at all. The answer is that goodness belongs primarily to the world as a whole, identifiable with God, the theos. It is from this that moral qualities filter down to individuals and their actions as a measure of their cooperation with or obstruction of the rational world plan.
Okay. So that's an important point too, the idea that goodness is living in accordance with nature and basically like that connection with God that you mentioned.
That's right. Or you could take a more pedestrian example is things have more significance within strict boundaries. For example, in the case of a game, okay? So if you're playing chess, checkers, or whatever it is, your world of the game is constricted by certain rules. Now, if it was a free-for-all, there were no rules, then any move that you would make, say, in a chess game, really doesn't have any significance.
Right.
But because there are rules, pawns move a certain way, bishops move a certain way, you have some freedom and flexibility within those rules to make meaningful choices and meaningful actions that maybe will lead to you winning the game.
Right.
So that was the point about morality doesn't have to be compatible with the determinism, but the determinism denotes morality. Morality requires that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, one other thing I wanted to mention here is particularly towards the end where it says goodness belongs primarily to the world as a whole, which is identifiable with God. There's a proto-Christianity in here.
Yeah.
So the God of the Stoics, that notion is embedded in the world, a material world, but the Christian conception would take God out of the world as a transcendent being.
Yeah, exactly. Being a
So
transcendent being separate from the world.
yes, but the life of the Christian or the religious person is living in accordance with whatever the rules are set down by that deity.
Yeah.
And by doing that, one's life attains significance versus if there was no determinism, if everything was free, which, the older I get, the more I see is not really the case. There is some kind of bounded freedom in place. One is free to operate within very strict limitations. And it's choice and it's morality connected with that choice.
Okay.
Okay? So, and that's all I got for the Stoics, unless you got any other questions.
No, I think that was we did a good job of covering the Stoic conception of physics and theology, and we got into there's that connection from physics and theology to their conception of ethics as well.
Right. But the important thing to remember about theology in particular is that it's not a transcendent God.
Oh, sorry, I had myself muted. I was just saying because we have this modern conception of an anthropomorphic God, and like you were saying, a divine God that's separate from the universe, which is very different from the Stoic conception of seeing God as basically part of the universe and not anthropomorphized.
Right. And that's why, for me personally, I would refer to it as like the divine instead of God, because God is too charged.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I hope that us covering the metaphysics, the physics, and some of the theology helps to undergird the Stoic ethics, because what I fear is that a lot of these, and I confess I haven't read them all, is a lot of these popular treatments of the Stoics only focus so much on the ethics instead of really going to get deep into what did the Stoics have to say about their cosmological view, which
Yeah.
you don't have to accept in 21st century. In fact, they were wrong about a lot of things, as was Aristotle in the physics and Plato in the physics, but you could still draw some lessons from that. This is okay, so this is what the Stoics had believed about the physical universe, the cosmos.
Yeah, yeah. It's
And the whole
very
thing about the
helpful.
Stoics is living in accordance with that.
Hmm. So if you know that the idea of Stoicism is living in accordance with nature, and you understand what they mean by living in accordance with nature, it makes a lot more sense.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, unless you have anything else to add there, I'll just say all the stuff I like to say at the end of my videos, and then you can give any plugs or final thoughts there if you want to.
Sure. Go ahead.
All right. So yeah, thanks everyone so much for watching another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. I hope you found it interesting and valuable for our discussion of the Stoic conception of physics and theology and how that leads into ethics. I thought it's really great that you can do these like deep dive philosophical conversations with me, and I really appreciate that, Tim, and all the book recommendations that you give to me, and going through all of these and really developing a much better understanding of different realms of philosophy. And yeah, like I always say, thanks so much to everyone who likes this video, subscribes to my channel, shares it, and especially to those of you who contribute to me on Patreon. I really appreciate that, and I'll put the link in the description for this video as I normally do. And also I'll add the link for our previous conversation, and like I did with our last conversation, I'll add the links for the 3 podcasts that you did with James Sullivan, which was a really good deep dive into postmodernism. And also, like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And be like the Stoics in that way, kind of. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. All right, keep having mindgasms, everyone. And you have any last words there, Tim?
Sure. So I just want to return to the book plugs, which Andrew can put in the low bar as the description. What I recommend as sources for this. The first one is the Stoics Reader, edited by Brad N. Wood and Lloyd P. Gerson, published by Hackett. The second one is The Hellenistic Philosophers by A. Long and D. N. Seedley from Cambridge University Press. The next one is The Cambridge History of Hellenistic Philosophy, came out in 2008. And the last one is Greek Philosophical Terms by F.E. Peters, a very good dictionary of Greek philosophical terms and explanations of the terms themselves.
What was that? What was that last one again? I'll write those down.
So it's Greek Philosophical Terms, a Historical Lexicon by F.E. Peters, published
Okay.
by New York University Press.
Okay. Yeah, I'll add that. I'll add those to the description for this video. Okay. All right. Well, yeah, like I said, thanks so much for talking. I really appreciate you talking with me and all our discussions and all of your book recommendations. And you're really helping me get a much better education in philosophy. And it's one of my favorite topics for sure. And I know it's one of yours too. And I know we're going to have plenty of more conversations. We're going to talk with Hayden soon about pragmatism and do kind of a deep dive on that, and probably multiple conversations. And I'm sure we'll all talk with James Sullivan, and I'm sure there'll be many more of these. So
Yeah,
yeah, thanks. I really appreciate it.
that pragmatism one is going to be at least a two-parter, I think, because
Yeah,
he wants to do the historical background first before we actually get into the pragmatism reader.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, hopefully next week. We'll see.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Okay.
All
Well,
right.
if I don't see you until next week, you have happy holidays.
Yeah, you too, man. Thanks a lot. You have a Merry Christmas and all that.
Okay, so we'll talk later.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Adios, everyone.